Well, I wrote it really as a business book, but it's got a lot of personal in it and a lot on relationship. And the business book is how to become successful, how to come back from adversity, how to handle adversity. And I think it's something that really people want to read, as you can see by what you're seeing right now.
So I was recently able to acquire a copy of the Donald Trump book, Trump, The Art of the Comeback, from 1997. This is actually a review copy before the book was actually published by Times Books. I got it on eBay and I'm pretty excited to check it out. This is kind of a rare book these days. It goes for over $200 on Amazon, so I was pretty lucky to get a copy. I'm going to do a little reading of each chapter and maybe break it up, but I plan to do a full audiobook. Introduction. It's usually fun being the Donald, but in the early 1990s, trust me, it wasn't. My journey is a hard one to believe. I was many billions in the hole. $975 million of that debt I'd personally guaranteed. The banks were crawling all over me. The Gulf War had a disastrous effect on tourism. Cash flows were dwindling at my casinos. Then I missed a mortgage payment on the castle in Atlantic City. All hell broke loose. Wall Street went nuts. The newspapers screamed of my demise. I was up against a wall. So I sold a few assets to stay afloat. Then, after being plummeted by my bankers, Ivana turned around and sued me for $2 billion. Life, I thought, looked bleak. Then one day around Christmas of 1990, I said to myself, Donald, it's time to fight back. So I got to work. Today I'm over $3 billion in the bank. I've paid off my personal debt, business is great, I'm single and available, and I'm loving life. I'm a firm believer in learning from adversity. Often the worst of times can turn you to your advantage. My life is a study of that. I learned so much during the tough years, so I decided to write it all down. If you're in trouble, or if you're down and out, I hope you'll be able to glean some of my hard-learned lessons in these pages. This isn't just a book about the ins and outs of deal-making, how to make deals come out, how to get the good deals and close the deal. My wish is that this book will provide inspiration. It's a tale that almost anyone, whether a broker, trader, lawyer, real estate exec, publisher, even a homemaker, something I know nothing about, can learn from. I learned a lot about myself during these hard times. I learned about handling pressure. I was able to home in, buckle down, get back to the basics, and make things work. I worked much harder. I focused, and I got myself out of a box. Don't get me wrong, there were moments of doubt, but I never thought in negative terms. I believe in positive thought and positive thinking. I learned a lot about loyalty, who was and who wasn't. There were people that I would have guaranteed would have stuck by me, who didn't. And on the other hand, people who I made, who when it came time to help me, didn't lift a finger. Take Sam LaFranc. He's crude by any standard, and I've always thought that he is the least respected, successful man I have ever met. Sam has a wonderful family, and his son Richard is truly outstanding. When I watch Richard in action, it's hard to believe that Sam could have produced such a guy. In any event, like all else having to do with loyalty, Sam LaFranc will kiss my ass in person. People tell me he was saying rotten things about me. I have no idea whether he did or did not. Whenever I ask him, he would deny it. Donnie, I would never fucking say that, he would proclaim, when in fact, I never had any doubts that he did. When times were good, Sam was very nice to me. I told him that as soon as things started getting bad. He was openly happy. Not to my face, but behind my back. Now Sam is calling me all the time asking for anything. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, just any kind of association. I sent him a copy of an article in which he slyly derided me. On top of the article, I wrote just 2 words, fuck you. As a result of these experiences, my thinking has changed. I'm sharper, I'm warier. I believe in an eye for an eye, like the Old Testament says, some of the people who forgot to lift a finger when I needed them, when I was down, they need my help now. And I'm screwing them against the wall. I'm doing a number, and I'm having so much fun. People say that's not nice, but I really believe in getting even. On the other hand, there were those I wouldn't have completely counted on who were loyal to the 9th degree. These people were not only loyal, they were warriors. They supported me and saw me through. These are the people I learned to rely on. What I love is doing deals. I also enjoy writing. My first book, Trump: The Art of the Deal, became an immediate New York Times #1 bestseller and was a terrific experience. Judging from the letters I received and the buzz the book generated, I reached a lot more people than I thought I would. In this book, I hope to do the same. My second book, Trump: Surviving at the Top, was also a #1 New York Times bestseller, despite the fact that my heart was never in it. Now I am doing the book that I wanted to do even more than my first book. Another thing that I'd like to do in this book, in fact, right now, is to apologize to 2 men I was too tough on in the last book. Malcolm Forbes is perhaps the best business editor of the 20th century, and I wish I had given him greater respect in print. At the time I was writing Trump: Surviving at the Top, Forbes magazine was attacking me, and I thought unfairly. In looking back over the last couple years since Malcolm's death, I realized that New York City lost a true character in him, a great asset, someone who added a lot of space and excitement to the complex, and often forbidding city. Not many people were able to be heard in New York, but Malcolm was, and I see now, much more than I did 2 years ago, how he is missed and even needed. Besides, why the hell should I be attacking him if his magazine goes after me? Malcolm was gone. He wasn't the only one kicking my ass, and maybe he might not have liked seeing me beat him up because I have this strange symbolic relationship with New York, a city that Malcolm truly loved. When I'm attacked in a strange way, so is New York. In any event, I realize now, much more than at the time of his death, that Malcolm Forbes brought great vitality and wisdom to a place that can use all the vitality and wisdom it can get. Another one of the biggest regrets about my second book was how harshly I wrote about Frank Sinatra. I didn't want it to come out the way it did. It was a strange evening, the night I met him. I reported about how Sinatra, over dinner in Monte Carlo with Ivana and me and another couple, blew up at his wife Barbara and made some fairly rude comments about women in general. I was shocked at the time, but what I realize now is, hey, the guy has a hell of a lot of pressure on him. He can't walk through a lobby without 100 people asking for his autograph. I didn't take this into account. Dealing with fame can truly be a hassle. Believe me, Frank, I realize that now. I shouldn't have written those things the way I did, and I'm sorry. I've come to realize that the entertainment business is the most vicious industry of all. Probably the hardest place to maintain a top position. Younger and better looking talents are waiting by the thousands to push you off the perch. Frank Sinatra has not only survived for 6 decades since he was a teenager, but he is, as everybody in the industry knows, the chairman of the board. Well, I haven't spoken to Frank since my last book was published, and I don't necessarily intend to speak to him again. I want to set the record straight. Perhaps he is different, perhaps he is tough, and perhaps he can even be nasty at times, but he has done one hell of a job, and there are very few like him. I believe that in order to succeed, or to get a place where you can start thinking about your future, you have to focus on the present. My policy is to learn from the past, focus on the present, and dream about the future. The danger is dreaming too much, and that there are so many things beyond our control. Wars, famine, anything can happen. At least with the present, you can factor in what's going on now. You have some control, but the future is very tough to predict. So I stay in the present and concentrate on current events. Luckily, I do every deal because I enjoy it. I don't do it for the money. The money just seems to flow in. People don't believe that. They laugh when I say it because they think I'm totally money-oriented. I'm not. It's been a terrific period of time. An amazing period of time. It's good to come out of a rough time because you really appreciate what you have much more. In the 80s, it seemed so simple, whereas now, I look at every detail I've done and appreciate the work and energy I've put into it. I enjoy my successes much more because I realize it wasn't so easy after all. Trump, The Art of the Comeback. The battle begins, bargaining with the banks. It never occurred to me to give up, to admit defeat. True, I was billions of dollars in the hole. The real estate market had disintegrated. Bodies were dropping left and right. Banks folded. The junk bond market was collapsing. There was no end in sight to the bad news. Front page headlines heralded my downfall. I became the poster boy for recession. Friends and family called me to offer condolences and support. Oddly enough, I wasn't that miserable. Sure, the chips were down, there were some dark moments, but I never had any doubt that I'd come back. I will never forget what happened on March 26, 1991. Both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal had front-page stories predicting my demise, detailing the financial trouble I was in. Anybody with a brain who read those stories would have said I was finished. The stories were picked up by radio and television and blasted throughout the world. This was by far the worst moment of my life. I was in the office and there was dead silence. The phone had stopped ringing because even my closest friends felt that it would be better to stay away rather than call in their regrets, something I had always hated anyway. It was then that Rana Graff, my very loyal secretary, came into my office and told me that Ivana was on the phone. We were separated at the time, and I thought to myself, how nice. Ivana was calling with her sympathies, or even better, with encouragement. That was really sweet. As it turned out, that was not at all the purpose of Ivana's phone call. I picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Ivana, how are you?" Ivana said as cold as ice, "I want my money now. I want my money now. I've decided to honor the contract, and I advanced a check for $10 million and all the other things immediately. I am no longer going to court. I want my money now." Then she hung up and I said to myself, wow, what a fucking mess. At that moment I realized it was time to go back to work. I had taken a siesta. I had relied on other people, many of them highly trained and educated executives. Sure, success in business takes education and training, but it all comes down to feel and touch. I've got the instincts. That's how I'd gotten on the top in the first place. I wasn't using my instincts anymore. I'd gotten bored, taken my eye off the ball. Why, I thought, should I have to work my ass off when I can get somebody else to do it for me? Everything had gotten too easy. My life had been a series of wins with a few, if any, failures. I went to the great Wharton School of Finance and did very well. I had quickly built a huge and successful company. I had made a few mistakes, certainly. None I could remember as having great consequence. I'll always remember that day in 1980, standing at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, watching Trump Tower begin to rise. Even before the construction started, I was selling apartments at a rate that few people had witnessed before. While I was looking up, somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hi Donald, how are you doing?" I looked over. It was Jerry Speyer, head of the Tishman reality firm. He's a great development pro. Jerry's a little older than me, and as it turns out, at that time at least, a little wiser. I began to tell him what a great success I was having renting the retail space and selling the apartments in Trump Tower. The atrium, I said, was a spectacular success. He had heard that and congratulated me. Then he paused and said, in effect, "Be careful of the markets, because when the markets change, you could take the best apartment in any building in New York City, and it's virtually got no sale value." I listened to him, but sort of laughed to myself. That was impossible, I thought. Look at the way things are going. Even in a bad market, I'd be able to sell apartments at 5th Avenue and 57th Street. I got a little cocky and probably a little lazy. I wasn't working as hard, and I wasn't focusing on the basics. I traveled around the world to the Spirit fashion shows in France. What the hell did I have to travel to Paris for when I have a better fashion show in New York? The models were the same, believe me. The clothes are beautiful, but I wasn't looking at the clothes. I began to socialize more, probably too much. Frankly, I was bored. I really felt I could do no wrong, sort of like a baseball player who keeps hitting home runs, or a golfer who keeps winning tournaments. You just get a feeling of invincibility. Ultimately, this invincibility feeling, while positive at times, can be destructive. You let down your guard, you don't work as hard. Then, things start to go in the wrong direction. And that's what happened to me. And I never thought it could. Sadly, Jerry was right. On that day of Fifth Avenue, 11 years later, in 1990, the market was so horrendous that prices, even for the best buildings in town, were plummeting. Apartments were being bought at prices you could never thought possible. It was a complete disaster. I personally witnessed the end of the real estate market and the beginning of what I term the Great Depression of 1990. That's right, I use the word depression. It was not a recession, it was in fact a depression, more severe than anything that had taken place since the early 1930s. Real estate markets were reeling, banks were failing, certain industries retailing, the airlines, and countless others were being virtually wiped out. You had to be really good to survive, and sadly, you had to be lucky. Many of my friends were talented, but not talented enough. Those friends are gone, never to be seen again on the business front. Many filed for bankruptcy, and many just gave up. They cashed in their chips, or far worse than that, were forced to work for somebody else. Pretty tough when you've always worked for yourself. Take my good friend, a real estate executive who had built up a fairly good fortune. Before writing this, I asked if it would be possible for me to say something about him. "Absolutely, Donald," he said, "but please don't say my name. I'm starting a new life and it's beginning to work out okay." This guy had a number of successful buildings and was well on his way to going to the top. In 1989, he was worth at least $50 million. He's a terrific guy, but he believed in laying all his chips down at once. It turned out his timing was wrong. By the end of 1990, he was completely wiped out. His wife and family had left him, and he started to drink heavily. It was a sad day when he came into my office and asked me to help him get a job. I was certainly having my own problems at the time, but he had no money, and in fact was overqualified for any kind of job available to him. Because he had helped me in the mid-1970s, when I was just starting out, I made a concerted effort to help him. It paid off. Today, he is a successful executive within another company, but he will never be able to attain the success he once had. He refers to those times as just a chapter in his life. Another good friend of mine, a very successful guy in the 70s and 80s, built a fortune of about $500 million, mostly in real estate. He had 4 children who he loved very much and decided in 1988 to give each child $10 million. He made this gift without hesitation, and not knowing that shortly after, a very bad time would be upon us. In 1990 and 1991, he was experiencing tremendous financial difficulty. He decided to go back to his children, to whom he had given this gift of $40 million, and ask each for $7.5 million so he could pay off bank loans at substantial discounts. It was a great opportunity for him, and he never had a doubt that they would gladly give him the money. He called a meeting, and to his amazements, the kids were dead set against returning even the smallest amount. They said to him, "Look, Dad, you got yourself in trouble. That's not our fault. You shouldn't have asked us to give the money back you gave us." He walked out of the room in total disbelief. I saw this man recently, and his business is doing well again. He was able to survive without the help of his kids. When I said to him, "How are your children? Have you forgotten them? Have you forgiven them?" He said, "Donald, what children are you talking about? I have no children. They're dead." I think this is a very sad story and truly feel that his children should be totally ashamed of themselves. In contrast, my father and I are very close. He really helped me through the bad times. Fred Trump is a rough and tumble guy and a wonderful businessman. He has always had great pride in my success, and for 15 years he has backed me whenever possible, never wavering once. Well, when times got bad, he continued to stand by me. He had no doubt that I would make it back. He would tell people, "Don't worry about Donald. I've watched him all of his life. Donald is a winner, and I know he will have no trouble." Times are tough for everybody, but Donald will be the one who ends up on the top. I have always appreciated his confidence in me. Another horrifying story, again the opposite of my own experiences, involves a man I know who made a very large bequest to a well-known university. The bequest was to be paid over a long period, but the amounts of money were substantial. When this man got into trouble in the early 1990s, he went to the university to ask for indulgence and essentially seek a temporary reduction or a cessation of payment. He left the meeting feeling really good and believing his was a routine request that would be honored. Unfortunately, the following week, he was delivered a legal notice demanding payment in full and stipulating that if the payment was not made, the university would immediately start a court action seeking the money and damages based on his pledge. He told me that he would never again get involved in such a situation. And as he makes his final payments to the school next year, he will be very happy in the knowledge that he will never have to make another payment to that institution. He is a very rich man again, and had his school behaved properly, the money it could have ultimately received would have been far greater than what he had already given. Because of this, whenever I make a long-term commitment to a school or charity, I stipulate that I have the right at any time, for any reason, to stop payment. Times change, economies change, and the world changes, and I won't be caught. My blip, as I call my difficult time, was much different from that of my friends. It was more of a sabbatical of sorts. If I had my eye on the ball, I'm sure I would have seen more of the problems on the economic horizon. The truth is, I did see some, and I got nervous. I got nervous when Washington passed a ludicrous tax law in 1986. It ended up being a disaster for both real estate and banking, and caused the depression of 1990 to 1993. More on that later. The fact is, I saw the signs, so I started selling. Unfortunately, when I went to sell, nobody else wants to buy because they figure I know something more than they do. Why should they buy something Donald Trump doesn't want? Fortunately, I did get off one deal before the deluge, and it was a beauty. I had acquired a terrific property in Midtown Manhattan for $70 million from Harry and Leona Helmsley, and for a short while later, in 1989, I sold it to Alan Bond for $180 million. That's about a $110 million profit on the deal, which just reinforced what I had stated before, that I felt I could do no wrong, that I didn't know how to hit anything less than a grand slam home run. Here I had bought a building from the great Harry Helmsley, and he was indeed a great man who unfortunately married the wrong woman, and sold it at a huge profit. In my eyes, this further proved my invincibility. How could I possibly fail? I'd had great success with the Grand Hyatt Hotel. Cash poured in from my casinos in Atlantic City. Trump Tower condos stayed on the market for a long time. It was a fantastic time, like the Roaring '20s, but of course it couldn't last. I learned at the Wharton School of Finance that the economy runs in cycles. I guess I forgot the second half of the lesson, along with everyone else in the business. Eventually, something's gotta give. This time, the give was precipitated by the U.S. government, more specifically by Congress. In 1986, the peak of the real estate market's boom, some pundits down in Washington, D.C. decided it was time to rein in on a few overzealous developers, who the polls claimed were unfairly taking advantage of tax breaks and favorable depreciation schedules. The 1981 tax code was revised, and the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1986 was passed, destroying just about any incentive anyone might have for investing in real estate. And you may remember, it included a stipulation that the tax laws be applied retroactively. Overnight developers and investors went bust by the thousands. The banks did just as badly. Here's why. First, TEFRA eviscerated the tax shelters in place to encourage investment, thereby leaving investors virtually no incentive to put their money into any type of development, including low and moderate income housing. Second, the income upper tax rate was lowered from 51% to 32%. Investing involves risk. With a 51% tax, investors might take a chance on a new housing project. If the project went south, the investor could recapture his losses in the form of a tax break. If an investor is taxed only 32%, why bother with the risk? The most damaging effort of this law, of course, that it would be applied retroactively. Property values fell off so much that developers who had never missed a loan payment were being forced upon because regulators, pointing to the advertibly devalued worth of their mortgage property demanded millions more in additional collateral. I couldn't believe that a government would allow deals to be made and then wipe them out. It's one thing to establish a new set of guidelines. It's another thing to say, guess what? The rules you were playing by and basing already done deals on are dead. Some people had to pay for tax shelters while at the same time paying taxes on the shelters they were buying. Most surprisingly, while I can understand politicians doing the wrong thing, I couldn't believe that the retroactive provisions would be upheld by the courts, but amazingly they were. It was a total disaster and incredibly unfair. People don't seem to understand this, and apparently members of the Supreme Court don't either. But in terms of economics, real estate is the backbone of this country. The industry alone accounts for 20% of the gross national product, employs 8 million workers, and generates $200 billion in tax revenues. Construction not only creates jobs, it spurs manufacturing. And consider the retail aspect. If people buy houses, they buy carpets, furniture, and so on. These politicians, many of whom had never functioned in the work of big business, or any business for that matter, couldn't see past their fingertips. They passed this thing into law without giving one thought to the long-term consequences. Witness to the domino effect. By 1993, 62% of all airlines had gone bankrupt. Fewer houses were under construction than in 1946, not since the Great Depression were so few workers employed. The Resolution Trust Corporation was forced to sell its property at 5 cents on the dollar. Real estate values sunk trillions of dollars during this time, and I imagine my despair as I watched every single asset I owned, condominiums, hotels, casinos, my airline, hit the skids. One day I was walking down Fifth Avenue hand in hand with Marla. I pointed across the street to a man holding a cup with a seeing eye dog. I asked, "Do you know who that is?" Marla said to me, "Yes, Donald, he's a beggar. Isn't it too bad? He looks so sad." I said, "You're right. He's a beggar, but he's worth about more than 9 million more than me." She looked at me and said, "What do you mean, Donald? How could he possibly be worth 9 million more than you?" I said, "Let's assume he's worth nothing, only from the standpoint of dollars. I'm worth minus 900 million. This was an interesting period of time because, as I told the story, I realized in my own mind that what I was saying was true. I also began to realize that I had better get back to work. My net worth had been in the billions. By the spring of 1990, I was deeply in the red. My empire was hemorrhaging value. When the Supreme Court upheld my retroactive provisions in 1992, I knew that was not for me, but for my colleagues as well. I knew that was not only for me, but for my colleagues as well. Prospects were grim. Even for the awesome Olympia in York, headed by the powerful Reichman family, the future looked bleak. I remember reading about the trials and tribulation of Paul Reichman and his O&Y empire. The company owed a staggering $20 million and was in deep, deep trouble. Its investments were shaky, and getting shakier all the time. It was unthinkable that O&Y could be going down, but I'm sure at hell it seemed that way by reading the papers. Paul Reichman made a huge error. He let his ego get in the way of his financial recovery. I remember the day I knew his end would come. I picked up a paper and read Death Knell story about O&Y, and Reichman was quoted saying O&Y still had a net worth of $5 billion. First of all, this probably wasn't true. Second, if you have $5 billion, why in the world would banks pity you and discount your debt? Forget it. I guess Paul just couldn't put his ego aside for a second and tell the banks how much trouble he was really in. It ended up hurting him badly. The company as we know it was totally wiped out, and Reichman was left holding the bag. I wasn't quite at that point yet, but I was close. The casinos in Atlantic City were throwing me enough cash to service the debt. I felt trapped. I wasn't quite at that point yet, but I was close. The casinos in Atlantic City weren't throwing off enough cash to service the debt. I felt trapped. So in March of 1990, I told Wall Street I might miss Trump Castle's $43 million principal and interest payment. This announcement reverberated around the world, and because I had never missed any payment before, suddenly bankers, some who I'd worked with for a decade, were doubting my ability to make any upcoming payments on my other loans. They were right to be skeptical. I wasn't sure myself where the money would come from. The problems at the casino could have triggered a series of defaults, forcing me into personal bankruptcy, and there was no way Donald Trump was going bankrupt. I would talk about bankruptcy, and I always use that probability as a tool to negotiate. But I'd never do it. That would end the game. So I dug in. I waited, and watched. I took tremendous punishment, and as I watched my empire collapsing around me, finally it became obvious to me and the rest of America that the economy was crashing for all. When this realization hit me, I decided I'd do everything in my power to suffer the pain as early as possible. Negotiate, I thought, before everyone else starts getting into the game. I now realize that if I had waited just 6 months longer to renegotiate terms with the banks, I might have lost everything. Because 6 months later, I would have to stand in line with a whole bunch of other Mongols who were trying to do the same thing. Work out a deal. Get a discount on debt. Buy some time. In retrospect, that decision was perhaps the smartest thing I did. Sure, it crushed my ego, my pride. I hated having to go to the bankers with my head in my hand, and yes, my lifestyle was a little cramped for a while. I guess that's all important. But getting a deal on the table without filing for bankruptcy was the most important thing of all. I decided there was no way I'd make the same mistake Paul Reichman has made. I wasn't going to let my ego get in the way. I figured I'd sell off a few assets and suffer a small hit to my ego in order to keep my 18,000 employees and keep afloat the thousands of family firms and suppliers that were dependent on the Trump organization for work. After all, these people would have found it much tougher to recover. I wouldn't have been able to look in the mirror if I had let them down. I knew I had to protect myself by being flexible. I never get attached to one deal or one approach. I keep a lot of balls in the air because most deals fall no matter how much promising they seem at first. This is particularly important now, since after I missed the castle payment, the bankers involved in my loans would certainly get more involved. I was fortunate enough to work with some tremendously talented people. Ann Lane of Citibank, Joe Magnello of Bankers Trust, and Peter Ryan of Chase Manhattan, to name a few. They were big picture types, not middle management bureaucrats lost in the minutiae. They were big picture types, not middle management bureaucrats lost in the minutiae. They often share my vision, and they brought to the table much of vision of their own. I dealt with some real jerks too. One was named Ben Berzin, who worked for the Mid-Atlantic Bank. He sometimes gave more than you would ever thought he could get, and sometimes gave nothing when it wouldn't have mattered to him. He was an amazing phenomenon. I cut a deal with him on a loan in Atlantic City that was secured by casino property, much of it guaranteed by me. The discount was tremendous. Frankly, I was a little surprised I was able to get so much out of him. During this period, Berzin acted normal and seemed very calm. But after he made the deal, he turned into a monster. For the smallest nothing, he would threaten to issue a default notice. Berzin would call up, and scream at people at the top of his lungs about nonsense. And yet, he gave me tens of millions of dollars in discounts. After I finished with this jerk, I called him to ask why. With his attitude, he made the deal in the first place. And after having made the deal, why was he so obnoxious? He really had no answer. I knew, and I think he knew in the end. that if he just sat back with me, as I originally asked him to do, he would have been paid out in full. Instead, I am proud to say he lost a lot of money on the transaction. I recall my first meeting with Berzin. It was very strange. He brought me into his office, and suddenly he started smiling. He showed me a plaque of his golf ball and a golf club, and happily told me this long story, how he foreclosed on the developer of this club, how he'd taken the club from the guy. I asked him if the developer was hurt, what kind of a guy he was. Berzin didn't know. He didn't care. All he knew was he'd beat this guy to the ground. I knew immediately what kind of jerk I was dealing with. Had I not made my deal with him in the beginning, he would have been impossible to deal with at the end. He was a huge detriment to the bank. On my loans alone, I believe he could have gotten the bank tens of millions of dollars more. Another banker who was incredibly disappointed in me was Patricia Goldstein of Citibank. She's a tough, hard-working woman with a very little social grace. She's not very well liked by those who know her, and she's particularly disliked within the real estate industry. Because she has Citibank on her shoulders, she thinks she's hot shit. And believe me, she's not. I'll never forget the time during my ongoing struggle that I got a call from Pat, crying hysterically into the phone. She told me that her husband was dying. He was being cared for at the hospital somewhere in the Bronx where, she said, they were treating him horribly. Was there anything I could do, she asked, to help getting him into Mary Manning Walsh, a home for the terminally ill, run by the Cerament Sisters in the Catholic Church? It was also a place that is virtually impossible to get into. I called a good friend, who in turn called the Bishop of New York. And essentially, I worked like hell to get her husband into a place that was harder to get him into than the Wharton School of Finance. The next day, I received a call from the bishop asking me if Miss Goldstein could be at the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning for a tour, and if the husband could be brought in immediately. Mr. Goldstein was admitted, and for the rest of his life had nuns hovering over him, praying for him, taking care of him like no one did before. Not only did Pat Goldstein never thank me, but as hard as it is to believe, when I dealt with her, she was nasty and mean. To top it off, she made a stupid deal for Citibank. Had she listened to my advice about the Plaza Hotel, the bank could have made hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars more than it ended up making. But she wouldn't listen to anybody, and the fact that I helped her in the most important way meant absolutely nothing to her. She tried to screw me at every corner. As a result, she prevented the bank from being able to take advantage of a great situation. I will never forget the day I was forced to call the banks to renegotiate my loans. This was something that I never thought could happen to me. It was awfully tough when you come from the top, and had been there for so long. I called a meeting. Most of my major banks were there, and my confidence was packed. I told them, in as nice a way possible, that I was in deep financial trouble, and that on top of that, I wanted more money, about $65 million. Their jaws fell to the floor. Their eyes glazed over. After the initial shock had worn off, we began to talk. Some were angry, all were concerned. But this is very early in the process. The reason I wanted the $65 million, I said, was that my business was good, but there was no liquidity in the markets. My projects were good. Unlike a Canary Wharf that was sucking O&Y dry, they were well located, with well-built, magnificent buildings. I hadn't incurred cost overruns or the other problems attendant to the most properties. What I did have, I explained to the dropped jaws in front of me, were great properties in a terrible market. The asset values had dropped, but the borrowings had not. In 1989, with approximately the same debt, I had a net worth of almost $2 billion, maybe more. By the end of 1990, I had the same debt levels, but I was in the red. The problem? Property values had plummeted so dramatically that all my projects were worthless. In retrospect, it all seems easy to understand. Nevertheless, at the time, it was one of the toughest meetings I have ever had. Essentially, I placed a big bet. Look, I said, I can tie you guys up for years in court proceedings, bankruptcy filings, and the other legal maneuvers I'm good at, when forced. But I'm willing to do something else. I told them that if they gave me $65 million in credit, used only to keep my valuable assets and good business going, I'd agree to end any thought of legal skirmishes. My side of the deal looked like this. First, the banks would float me $65 million to keep my head above the water. Second, no single banks could lay claims against me for 5 years, until June 30th, 1995. Third, all interest and principal on loans would be deferred until that time. It was a win-win situation for all. I was able to buy some time in hopes that the casino or the real estate markets would rebound, and the banks were able to collateralize their unsecured debt and consolidate the rest. This is the biggest bet on my life, and boy did it pay off. Had I tried to make this deal 6 months earlier, it would have been impossible. The banks were becoming more and more illiquid. There was no way they would be able to allow all the money to go out. They were as tight as I was then. Timing, once again, was everything. The short of it is, the banks got smart. In order to save the vast amounts of time and money entailed in what would have been one of the most complicating proceedings ever, the banks more than calculated. They enthusiastically agreed to my proposal. I kept my business going. I had liquidity. And I never took down more than $45 million of the $65 million credit line. I started paying off one loan after another. I was working like never before. While I had excuses with other bankers, I had also earned a respect for bankers in general. Some of the people I dealt with were as smart and as cunning as you can imagine. They were also good people. Some of them, such as Magnello Ryan, Ann Lane, Peter Bauman, Tony Tirico, and Steve Bush, would do well wherever they went. And I really owed them a lot, not only for their wisdom, but for their flexibility and understanding. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Ann Lane of Citibank called me and said, "Donald, sorry to wake you up, but can you get up and immediately come into our war room? We're having trouble with 3 banks, one in Austria, one in Japan, and one in Singapore. We think you should be here to talk to the presidents of the banks yourself. If we don't get them, the whole deal will collapse because we must get all 90 banks unanimously." At 3:15 a.m. on a cold, wintry morning, with sleet falling from the skies, I got up and walked 10 blocks to Citibank. My driver was at his home, and so, I guess, were the rest of New York City's taxi cab drivers. I arrived drenched and cold. I turned to Ann and said, "This is a new low point." Anyway, Ann Starr, she's the one who guided Robert Murdoch through his troubles at Citibank, which launched his tremendous comeback and success. She met with an army of assistants. We placed the calls one by one, and I was able to convince the banks to do what was in their best interest and also in mine. I may have been successful, but it certainly wasn't fun. This was one of the most complicated transactions of the 90s. 90 banks had billions of dollars in debt. I will always remember the morning of June 30th, 1990. I arrived at the law offices of Well Gottel, Manges, and Rosen at 8 a.m. They were greeting me, stacked 2 feet high and spread across every inch of their largest conference table were 2,000 documents, all of which needed my signature. I started signing. The clock hit 10 a.m. Wait, I asked some associate, "Where's my lawyer?" The partner I dealt with for the past 15 years was an old friend and confidant. I couldn't believe he wasn't there at 8. And here it was 10? The clock hit noon. "Where is he?" I asked. Another associate told me he was in a meeting. It took me 2 days to sign all the documents, and this guy finally showed up. 15 years of deals, 15 years of business, and he shows up late. He regrets that now, and he has paid a big price with me. Anyway, it was the best deal I ever made. One thing I learned from all this: sometimes the best thing you can do is just let things ride. Let time go by. There were moments when I felt bored, useless, like my hands were tied. I wanted to do something. But the truth was, a lot of the negotiating took place didn't really have much to do with me. It was more involved with huge conference room of mid-level bankers quibbling over millions of dollars of secured and unsecured debt. They would certainly do this without me. It was mainly out of my control. As a result, I had a lot of time in my hands. That's when I decided to take up golf again. It helped me relax and to concentrate. It took my mind off my problems. I only thought about putting the ball into the hole, and it certainly beat hanging around the office waiting for my phone to ring. Why sit around the office bugging people on the phone or having people bug you when you can get some sun, relax, and take your mind off your problems? The irony is, of course, is that I made so much damn money playing golf during those months. I remember one Sunday, in particular, when it looked like things were really coming to an end. One banker truly hated me and was looking to cause a lot of problems. My lawyers that weekend were drawing up nasty papers, and so was his bank. It looked like it was going to be a very, very big fight, which ultimately would have been bad for both of us. I was hitting balls on the range and didn't really feel like going out to play when a friend of mine came over and said, "Would you like to play golf with so-and-so?" "Wait a minute, Dan," I replied. "Isn't he the head of Bank X?" The answer was yes. Does he know that you're asking me to play golf with you guys?" I asked. "No, he doesn't. But why would there be a problem?" Look, if you go back to him and say that it's me and he still wants to play, I would find that to be very interesting. My friend told the banker, who looked up and nodded and said, begrudgingly, "Let's play." The round started off very badly, in that the bankers were unable to get his ball airborne. The round started off very badly, in that the banker was unable to get his ball airborne. He played 2 or 3 holes terribly. I said to him, "Look, your grip is really bad. If you could just move your hands over, I think you'd be a much better player." I repositioned his hands and he started hitting the ball better than he had ever hit it before. With just that one minor change, he actually became a better player. He never had a better time and even went to the driving range afterward to practice with his new grip. More important, he thought I was a nice guy, not the vicious, flame-throwing jerk he had envisioned. He couldn't believe it. As we were leaving the course, he said to me, "Look, I know we're going to war tomorrow, but maybe we can make a deal." I laid out the terms of a deal that would be fair to all, and he agreed. The next morning, his lieutenants, who had until that point been totally vicious, called my people and informed them that a deal had been made and to get the paperwork done. We signed the next day, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of problems went away, just like that. Just for some contrast, I'll divulge this tale. I once saw Jack Nicklaus and told him, "You know, Jack, I've actually made much more money playing golf than you have." He didn't really understand what I meant, nor did I explain, but he probably went away thinking I'm a real jerk. Boxing, like golf, is a microcosm of life. Boxing, like golf, is a microcosm of life in its raw competitiveness, its unpredictability. Boxing, like business, is do or die. One of the greatest boxing matches I've ever seen was between Julio Cesar Chavez and Meldrick Taylor. There's no question about it that pound by pound Chavez was the greatest fighter around. His 82-0 record was proof of that. Julio was a craftsman, a workman. When he got into the ring, he would immediately immobilize his opponent, then destroy him. Meldrick Taylor, on the other hand, had a reputation for being a fancy, quick, and beautiful to watch man in the ring. During their now legendary fight, Meldrick danced around the ring, getting shots in whatever he could, while Julio, not looking so pretty, inflicted tremendous damage. In the 12th round, realizing how close the match was, Meldrick made a huge mistake. Instead of dancing through the last round and possibly through the speed and quickness, winning the fight on points, he decided to mix it up with Julio. This was a terrible strategy. When you're doing well, maybe even winning, against somebody who remains unbeaten after 10 years, you don't try to knock him out. History had already proven Julio a champion, but in the final round, these two great warriors went to the middle of the ring and just started banging. Incredible amounts of pain were inflicted on Meldrick, and the people in the audience were wincing. He started to back up, his legs got weak, and Julio got him against the ropes, continuing to beat him unmercifully. They stopped the fight with only a few seconds left, and Julio won. Meldrick Taylor never got another chance at Chavez. That fight seemed to end his career as a real boxer. But if he does, there's no way he'll make the same mistake again. By 1993, I began to feel more like Chavez than like Taylor. My personal debt of $975 million had been reduced to $115 million, and I had 2 years to finish cleaning it up. There was no way to deny that things were going really great. Piece by piece, deal by deal, a beautiful picture was beginning to emerge. What my people and I had already achieved was astonishing. I began to prosper a long time before the newspapers and the other media acknowledged it. Apart from realizing my modest success, the media was, in fact, gleefully predicting my collapse. At a time when I knew I was coming on strong, this went on for about 2 years. I call it a period of the unknown. I had sold some assets, my yacht, the Trump shuttle, and a few others. But for the most part, I kept everything I had in the first place and just reduced debt. Thinking back, it's really amazing that today I'm worth much more than I was in the 80s. I have mostly the same assets and many more. The company is far bigger and doing better than it ever did before. Chapter 2 will be called Rebuilding the Boardwalk, Trump's New Skyline.